Medical examiners called it blunt for trauma consistent with a hydraulic press. The tabloids called it the VULKOV curse. For 3 years, the alpha king of the Silver Pine Territory, Maddox VULKOV, lived in isolation. Standing 7'2" and weighing over 300 pounds of pure muscle, he was a biological anomaly, a weapon of war that could not be switched off. 3 women had tried to claim the title of queen. 3 women left the estate in body bags. The world agreed to mate with Maddox was a death sentence. But on November 14th, a terrified Omega named Sienna O'Malley walked into the lion's den. Not because she wanted power, but because she had no choice. This is the true story of the monster who didn't want to be saved, and the girl who survived the night. Rain hammered against the slate roof of the Assembly Hall in Forks, Washington. It was a miserable night for a mating ceremony. Yet, the parking lot was full of black SUVs. The atmosphere inside wasn't festive, it was funereal. The annual gathering of the North American PAX was usually a time for alliances and drinking, but this year, the air tasted like ozone and fear. Maddox VULKOV sat on the mahogany dais, a solitary figure that seemed to absorb the light around him. Even seated, the man was terrifying. His shoulders spanned nearly twice the width of the beta standing beside him. The fabric of his custom-tailored suit strained against biceps that were thicker than most men's thighs. He didn't look like a king, he looked like a loaded cannon waiting for a spark. He stared at the floor, his jaw set so hard a muscle twitched visibly beneath his scarred cheek. He didn't want to be there. The council demands a Maid Alpha, his advisor, a graying wolf named Vance, whispered. The treaty with the Southern Pax depends on it. You need an heir. Maddox didn't answer. He just looked at his hands. Hands that were rumored to have crushed a grizzly bear's skull during a border dispute. He hated them. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder as the eligible females were paraded forward. It was barbaric, archaic, and necessary. But unlike previous years, no one was stepping forward to volunteer. The daughters of the high-ranking Alphys women who usually fought for the crown were cowering behind their fathers. They had heard the stories. They knew about Cynthia, the first wife, found broken at the bottom of the stairs. Knew about Elena, whose heart simply stopped on her wedding night. Next, the master of ceremonies barked. A frail girl was shoved forward. She couldn't have been more than 19. She was trembling so violently her teeth chattered. This was Chloe O'Malley. She was an unranked wolf, a nobody from a defunct pack in Idaho. Her father, a gambler with debts to the wrong people, had put her name in the lottery in exchange for a cleared ledger. Maddox looked up. His eyes were the color of frozen moss. He saw the terror in Chloe's face. He let out a low growl, a sound that vibrated in the chests of everyone in the front row. It wasn't aggression. It was a warning. Run, his eyes seemed to say. Get away from me. Chloe sobbed. Please, she whimpered. Please don't make me. The crowd went silent. To reject an alpha king was treason. To reject Maddox VULKOV was usually suicide. She is the chosen tribute, the master of ceremonies announced coldly. The debt must be paid. Maddox stood up. The sound of his chair scraping back was like a gunshot. He towered over the room, casting a long shadow over the weeping girl. He took a step down from the dais. The floorboards creaked under his immense weight. I will not take a mate who smells of fear. Maddox's voice was deep, gravelly, like stones grinding together. Take her away. The debt remains, Maddox. A voice shouted from the back. It was Chloe's father. Someone has to pay. Maddox snarled, his control slipping. The beast inside him, the mega alpha gene that made him a freak of nature, was clawing at the surface. He needed to leave before he hurt someone. Again. I will take her place. The voice was soft, barely audible over the rain, but it cut through the tension like a razor. Heads turned. From the shadows of the exit doors, a figure stepped forward. She was small, painfully small. She wore a faded waitress uniform and a soaking wet raincoat. She pulled back her hood, revealing messy auburn hair and eyes that burned with a strange, desperate resolve. It was Sienna O'Malley, Chloe's older sister. Sienna was an Omega. In the hierarchy of wolves, she was at the bottom, physically weaker, submissive by nature, usually relegated to domestic duties. Standing 5'3", she looked like a child compared to the titan on the stage. "Sienna, no," Chloe screamed. Sienna ignored her sister. She walked down the center aisle, her wet sneakers squeaking on the polished floor. She didn't look at the crowd. She kept her eyes locked on Maddox. Maddox froze. He had faced armies, rogue packs, and federal investigations. He had never seen anything as confusing as this tiny woman walking toward her death. "You are an Omega," Vance scoffed. "You cannot handle the Alpha's energy. You would burn out in a week. The lost eights a volunteer supersedes a lottery pick," Sienna said, her voice shaking but her chin high. She stopped at the foot of the dais. She had to crane her neck back just to look Maddox in the eye. "I volunteer. I take the debt. I take the bond." Maddox looked down at her. He could snap her neck with 2 fingers. He could crush her just by rolling over in his sleep. She was fragile, breakable. "Do you have a death wish, girl?" he asked quietly. "I have a sister," Sienna replied. "And I won't let you kill her." Maddox flinched. The accusation hit its mark. Liher. That's what everyone thought. That he was a murderer. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. He smelled like pine, rain, and raw, overwhelming power. The sheer pressure of his aura usually made Omgeza faint. Sienna's knees buckled, but she grabbed the edge of the dais to stay upright. She didn't look away. "I am not a prize," Maddox whispered for her ears only. "I am a graveyard." "Then bury me," Sienna whispered back. "But let her go." Maddox stared at her for a long, agonizing minute. He saw the terror in her pulse, the way her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. But he also saw a fire that he hadn't seen in the eyes of the warriors or the high-born ladies. He straightened up, his face becoming a mask of stone. "Done," Maddox boomed, his voice echoing off the rafters. "The Omega is mine. The ceremony is tonight." He turned and stormed off the stage without looking back, leaving Sienna standing alone in the center of the room, shivering as the realization of what she had just done crashed down on her. The drive to the VULKOV estate took 2 hours. Sienna sat in the back of the armored Cadillac Escalade. The leather seats were cold. Next to her, Maddox took up 2/3 of the bench. He hadn't said a word since they left the hall. He stared out the tinted window, watching the pine trees blur into a wall of black. Sienna tried to control her breathing. She knew the statistics. She had read the blog posts on the Wolf Watch forums. Maddox VULKOV's curse. They said his wolf was too big for his human body, that the internal conflict made him violent and unpredictable during the mating cycle. They said he lost control and tore his mates apart. She looked at his hand resting on his knee. It was the size of a catcher's mitt. The knuckles were white. He wasn't relaxed. He was tense, rigid as a board. "Stop shaking," Maddox said. He didn't turn his head. "I can't," Sienna admitted. "I'm not going to eat you in the car," he grunted. "That's comforting." Maddox turned slowly. A flicker of surprise crossed his face. Most people didn't use sarcasm with him. They begged or they flattered. "You have a mouth on you, Omega. I have a name. It's Sienna." "Sienna." He tested the word. It sounded foreign on his tongue. "Why did you really do it? Your father's debt could have been paid another way. I would have written a check." Sienna blinked. "They said you demanded a mate. That you wouldn't accept money." Maddox's eyes narrowed. "Who told you that?" "The master of ceremonies." "And your beta, Vance?" Maddox looked forward again, a dark scowl forming. "Vance talks too much." The car slowed as they approached the gates of the VULKOV estate. It was a fortress. 12-foot stone walls topped with razor wire. Security cameras buzzed and pivoted as the vehicle passed. The mansion itself was a sprawling Gothic revival structure made of dark stone, perched on the edge of a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. It was beautiful, but it looked lonely. The car stopped. The driver opened the door. Maddox got out first. When Sienna stepped out, the wind off the ocean nearly knocked her over. Maddox's hand shot out, catching her arm to steady her. His grip was shockingly gentle, but the heat radiating from his skin burned through her coat. He let go immediately, as if he had been burned. "Inside," he commanded. The foyer was cavernous. A grand staircase swept up to the second floor. The staff was lined up: maids, cooks, groundskeepers. They kept their heads bowed. No one looked at Sienna. It was as if she was already a ghost. "Dinner is served in the West Wing, Alpha," Vance said, stepping out of the shadows. He looked at Sienna with a mixture of pity and disdain. "Shall I prepare the bridal suite?" Maddox stiffened. "No." Vance paused. "Sir, put her in the blue room down the hall." "But the mating rites." "I said the blue room," Maddox roared. The sound was so loud a vase on a side table rattled. The staff flinched. Sienna took a step back. Maddox closed his eyes, inhaling deeply through his nose, forcing the beast back down. "She sleeps alone tonight. Get out of my sight." Vance bowed low, a sly smile touching his lips that only Sienna caught. "As you wish." Dinner was a silent affair. Sienna sat at one end of a 20-foot table, Maddox at the other. He ate quickly, efficiently, tearing into a rare steak. Sienna pushed peas around her plate. "Eat," Maddox said. "You're too thin. You'll break." "Is that what happened to the others?" Sienna asked. The words tumbled out before she could stop them. Maddox dropped his fork. The clatter echoed in the silence. He stood up and walked toward her. Sienna froze, her heart hammering. He didn't stop until he was standing right behind her chair. She could feel the heat of his body. She waited for the blow. She waited for the rage. Instead, he leaned down, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "They didn't break because they were thin, Sienna. They died because this house is poisoned, and I was arrogant enough to think I could protect them." He walked to the door. "Lock your door tonight. Do not open it for anyone. Not even me." "Where are you going?" she asked. "To the cellar," Maddox said, his hand on the doorknob. "Where monsters belong." He slammed the door. Sienna didn't sleep in the blue room. After 2 hours of lying awake, listening to the wind howl, curiosity overcame fear. She had to know. She crept out into the hallway. The house was silent. She followed the faint scent of damp earth and iron, Maddox's scent. It led her down the back stairs, past the kitchen, to a heavy steel door that looked like it belonged on a bank vault. It was slightly ajar. Juliana peeked inside. It wasn't a dungeon. It was a high-tech containment unit. The walls were reinforced concrete. And there in the center of the room was the mighty Alpha King. He wasn't sleeping on a bed of silks. He was chained. Heavy titanium cuffs bound his wrists and ankles, 2 large steel bolts in the floor. He was stripped to the waist, sweat glistening on his massive back. He was shaking, fighting against himself, his muscles spassing as the wolf tried to force the shift. He had chained himself up to ensure he couldn't hurt anyone if he lost control in his sleep. Sienna watched, her hand over her mouth. He wasn't the predator the world said he was. He was the prisoner. Suddenly, Maddox's head snapped up. His eyes were glowing a feral amber. He sniffed the air. "Sienna," he growled, the voice distorted and inhuman. "Run." Sienna didn't run. Her instincts screamed at her to flee, to scramble up the stairs and lock herself in the blue room as ordered. The man, the creature in front of her, was a nightmare made flesh. Maddox's muscles were bunching and rolling under his skin as if something was trying to break out of him. The titanium chains groaned under the strain. His growl was low, vibrating through the concrete floor and into the soles of her sneakers. But she saw his eyes. Amidst the glowing amber of the wolf, there was a sliver of human panic. He wasn't trying to break free to kill her. He was trying to stay chained to save her. "Get out," Maddox roared, the words tearing from his throat. Leanna took a step forward. No, she whispered. She took another sip. The air in the room was heavy, charged with static electricity. It smelled of ozone and burning wood. This was the alpha aura, the crushing weight that usually forced wolves to their knees. But Sienna was an omega. Her biology wasn't built to challenge an alpha. It was built to soothe one. "You are hurting yourself," she said, her voice gaining a surprising steadiness. She could see the metal cuffs digging into his wrists, drawing blood. "I will kill you," Maddox snarled, snapping his teeth. Saliva dripped from his jaw. "I can't stop it." "You can," Sienna said. She was 3 feet away now. She could feel the heat radiating off him like a furnace. "You're not a monster, Maddox. You're just in pain." She reached out a hand. Maddox flinched violently, squeezing his eyes shut. "Don't touch me." "The last one who touched me during a shift ended up in the ICU. Sienna didn't listen. She placed her small, trembling hand on his massive, sweating shoulder. The effect was instantaneous. A shockwave went through the room. It wasn't an explosion, but a sudden, violent silence. The moment her skin touched his, the chaotic energy swirling around Maddox seemed to ground itself. It was like a lightning rod catching a storm. Maddox gasped, his eyes flying open. The feral amber faded, replaced by his natural moss-green irises. He stared at her hand on his shoulder, then up at her face, his expression one of utter bewilderment. "How?" he rasped. "The pain. It stopped." "My mother was a healer," Sienna lied softly. "She wasn't a healer. She was just an omega who refused to be afraid. She taught me that pain is just fear leaving the body." She moved her hand to his cheek. His stubble was rough against her palm. He leaned into her touch, closing his eyes again, but this time in relief, not agony. The mega-alpha rage, the chemical imbalance that had plagued him for years, was quieting down. "You're so small," Maddox murmured, his voice returning to its deep human baritone. "I could crush you by accident." "Then don't," Sienna said simply. "Unhang yourself, Maddox. You don't belong in a cage." Maddox looked at the cuffs. With a heavy sigh, he reached down. He didn't use a key. He simply pulled. The reinforced steel bolts sheared off the floor with a screech of tearing metal. Sienna's eyes widened. The strength required to do that was incalculable. He stood up, towering over her, the broken chains dangling from his wrists. He looked at his hands, then at her. For the first time in 3 years, the fog in his mind had cleared. "You stayed," he said, as if stating a miracle. "I stayed," she confirmed. Maddox scooped her up in his arms. He didn't ask. He just lifted her as easily as if she were a doll. Sienna gasped, clutching his bare shoulders. "Where are we going?" "Upstairs," Maddox said, walking toward the door. "If you are going to be my queen, you will not sleep in the guest room. And you will certainly not sleep in the basement." The next morning, sunlight streamed into the master suite. It was a room fit for a king, gold leaf trim, velvet curtains, and a bed the size of a small island. Sienna woke up alone in the bed, buried under a mountain of down comforters. She sat up, checking herself. She was wearing one of Maddox's t-shirts, which hung on her like a dress. She was alive. She wasn't hurt. The door opened. It wasn't Maddox. It was Vance, the advisor. He froze in the doorway, a silver tray in his hands. His eyes wide, and when he saw Sienna sitting up, yawning, he looked as if he had seen a ghost. "Good morning, Vance," Sienna said, stretching. "Is that coffee?" Vance composed himself quickly, his face settling back into a mask of polite indifference. "Miss O'Malley, I did not expect to find you here. The alpha usually requires solitude after a difficult night." "He slept on the couch," Sienna said, pointing to the leather sofa at the far end of the room. "He snores." It was a lie. Maddox hadn't slept. He had sat in a chair by the window all night, watching her, guarding her. He had left only an hour ago to handle pack business. Vance walked over and placed the tray on the nightstand. "Drink this." It is a tonic prepared by our pack physician Dr. Arys. It helps with the adjustment to the alpha's energy. The liquid in the crystal glass was a murky green. It smelled faintly of almonds. Sienna reached for it, but her hand stopped. Her nose wrinkled. Omgeza had a heightened sense of smell for things that were off: spoiled meat, sickness, danger. It was an evolutionary trait to protect the pups. The drink didn't smell like medicine. It smelled like foxglove and wolfsbane. "I'm not thirsty," Sienna said, pulling her hand back. "I insist," Vance said, his voice dropping an octave. "The Alpha commands it." "Does he?" The voice came from the doorway. Maddox stood there, dressed in a fresh charcoal suit. He looked imposing, healthy, and most importantly angry. Vance spun around. "Alpha, I was just attending to your mate." Maddox walked into the room. He didn't look at Vance. He looked at the glass. He picked it up. "Dr. Arys prescribed this?" Maddox asked. "Yes, sir. For her nerves." Maddox brought the glass to his lips. "No," Sienna shouted, scrambling out of bed. Maddox paused. He looked at Sienna, then back at Vance. Vance was sweating. A single bead of perspiration rolled down the older wolf's temple. "Why did she yell, Vance?" Maddox asked softly. "Is there something wrong with the tonic?" "She is hysterical, Alpha. The bonding process." Maddox smashed the glass against the wall. The green liquid hissed as it hit the paint, bubbling slightly. "Get out," Max said. The command was absolute. Vance bowed stiffly and hurried out of the room. Maddox turned to Sienna. His face was pale. "You knew," he said. "How did you know?" "It smelled wrong," Sienna whispered. "Maddox, that wasn't medicine." Maddox walked to the window, staring out at the gray ocean. "For 3 years I have been losing my mind, losing control. My strength has been growing, but my sanity has been slipping. Dr. Arys has been treating me for hyperalpha aggression syndrome." He turned back to her, his eyes burning with a cold, terrifying realization. "They haven't been treating me, Sienna. They've been poisoning me. They wanted me to go mad. They wanted me to kill my mate so the council would deem me unfit to rule." "Who?" Sienna asked. "Vance," Maddox said. "And whoever is pulling his strings. They want the throne. And they realized they couldn't kill me in a fight, so they tried to make me kill myself." He walked over to her and took her hands. His grip was firm. "You are in danger here. Every second you stay, you are a target." "I'm not leaving," Sienna said stubbornly. "Sienna, no." She cut him off. "They think you're a monster. They think I'm a victim. Let's use that. Tonight is the winter solstice gala. All the pack alphas will be there. Vance expects you to be drugged and unstable. He expects me to be terrified." She looked up at him, her brown eyes fierce. "Let's show them the king is back." The grand ballroom of the Vulkov estate hadn't been used in 5 years. Dust covers had been pulled off the chandeliers, and the floor had been polished until it looked like black ice. At 8 o'clock, MP. The limousines began to arrive. The elite of the werewolf world stepped out, alphas in tuxedos, lunas in designer gowns. They were there too, Gawk. They were there to see the Mad King and his new victim. Rumors were already circulating that the new girl was dead or in the hospital. Bets were being exchanged in the corners of the room. Vance stood near the bar nursing a scotch, smiling thinly at the guests. He checked his watch. He had spiked the Alpha's private decanter an hour ago. By now, Maddox should be foaming at the mouth. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer called out, though his voice wavered. "Please welcome the Alpha King, Maddox Vulkov." The double doors at the top of the grand staircase swung open. The room went silent. Maddox appeared. He was magnificent. He wore a tuxedo that had been cut to accommodate his massive frame, accentuating the width of his shoulders. He didn't look sick. He didn't look mad. He looked like a god of war in formal wear. And on his arm was Sienna. She wasn't wearing the drab waitress uniform anymore. She wore a gown of shimmering emerald silk that hugged her curves and pooled at her feet. Her auburn hair was pinned up, revealing her slender neck. But it was the mark on her neck that drew every eye. It wasn't a bite mark, they hadn't completed the mating bond yet, but she wore the VULKOV family crest, a diamond necklace that had belonged to Maddox's mother. It was a declaration of protection. They descended the stairs together. Maddox moved with a predatory grace, his eyes scanning the room. He spotted Vance. He smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. He looked stable, a Southern alpha whispered to Vance. Temporary, Vance hissed, his glass cracking in his hand. Wait for the first dance. The orchestra began to play a waltz. Maddox led Sienna to the center of the floor. I don't know how to waltz, Sienna whispered, gripping his shoulder. Just follow me, Maddox murmured. I won't let you fall. They moved together. It was awkward at first, the size difference comical, but then they found a rhythm. Maddox was surprisingly light on his feet. For a moment, the world fell away. Then he looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and the tension in the room shifted from fear to awe. Then the sabotage hit. As the music swelled, a waiter accidentally tripped near them. A tray of champagne flutes shattered on the floor. The sharp sound was like a gunshot. Simultaneously, a high-frequency emitter hidden in the flower arrangements, a device illegal in wolf territories, activated. It emitted a sonic pulse that only canines could hear. Every wolf in the room winced, covering their ears. But for an alpha of Maddox's size and sensitivity, it was torture. Max roared, dropping to one knee. He clutched his head. His eyes flashed amber. The beast, agitated by the noise, clawed at his mind. He's turning, someone screamed. He's going rogue. Vance stepped forward, feigning concern. Guards, restrain him, he's going to hurt the girl. 3 security guards loyal to Vance rushed forward with stun batons. No, Sienna screamed. She didn't run away. She threw herself between Maddox and the guards. Stay back, she yelled. She was 5'3", facing down 3 armed men. Move, girl, one guard sneered. He's dangerous. He's not dangerous, Sienna cried, turning to cup Maddox's face. He was growling, his teeth elongated, fighting the pain in his head. Maddox, listen to me. Focus on my voice. It's a noise. It's just a noise. Maddox's vision was red. The urge to kill everything in the room was overwhelming. But then he felt her hands. Small, worn. Anchor. Sienna. The name cut through the red haze. He looked up. A guard was raising a stun baton to strike Sienna, thinking she was in the way. The Mad King vanished. The protector emerged. Maddox moved faster than the eye could follow. He stood up, shielding Sienna with his body, and caught the stun baton mid-swing. The electricity crackled against his palm, but he didn't even flinch. He crushed the baton in his hand, metal and plastic shattering. He grabbed the guard by the throat and lifted him 3 feet off the ground. You dare, Maddox's voice was a low thunder, raise a weapon against my mate. He threw the guard across the room. The man slid across the polished floor, crashing into the buffet table. The room was frozen. Maddox stood panting, his arm wrapped protectively around Sienna. He wasn't mindless. He was fully in control. He turned his gaze to Vance. Find the source of that noise, Maddox commanded the room, and bring me the man who planted it. Vance turned to run, but the Southern Alpha, realizing he had been played, blocked his path. I believe the king gave an order, the Southern Alpha said, crossing his arms. The shattered crystal of the champagne flutes on the floor was merely the prelude. The true symphony of destruction began with a whistle sharp, piercing, and terrifyingly human. Vance stood by the heavy oak doors, his face twisting from the mask of a loyal advisor into the sneer of a usurper. He dropped his empty glass, the sound lost in the sudden deafening crash that followed. The floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the storm-lashed cliffs exploded inward. A freezing wind carrying the scent of salt spray and wet fur shrieked into the ballroom, extinguishing the candles in the chandeliers. Then came the wolves. They were not the noble, groomed shifters of the high packs. These were Feral's exiles who had succumbed to the madness of the wolf, their minds eroded by bloodlust and isolation. Their fur was matted with mud and old gore, their ribs showing through patchy coats, their eyes rolling in a frenzy of hunger. There were a dozen of them, a tide of nightmares pouring over the Velvetropes. "Kill the king," Vance screamed, retreating behind the wall of snarling beasts, pulling a serrated dagger from his jacket. The blade glistened with a dark, viscous oil-concentrated wolfsbane. "And kill the girl first, break him." The ballroom dissolved into bedlam. Screams tore through the air as the elite of the werewolf world scrambled for cover. Tables were overturned, expensive china shattering under the stampede of high heels and dress shoes. Alphas shoved their lunas behind pillars, baring their teeth, but the sheer ferocity of the feral intrusion caught them off guard. Maddox didn't flinch. He didn't run. He looked at the chaos, then down at Sienna. His eyes were no longer the confused, pained amber of a man fighting a drug-induced fog. They had hardened into the cold, calculated green of a predator who had finally identified his prey. The sonic whine that had crippled him moments ago was still drilling into his skull, a white-hot spike of agony, but the threat to Sienna overrode the pain. It relegated the torture to background noise. "Stay behind me," Maddox commanded. His voice wasn't a shout. It was a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards, felt more than heard. "Do not move, Maddox. There are too many." Sienna cried, her hands clutching the lapels of his tuxedo jacket. She could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, not in fear, but in anticipation. "For a normal alpha." "Yes," Maddox said. He reached up and tore his silk bow loose, tossing it aside. He unbuttoned his collar, the fabric straining as the muscles in his neck corded thick as steel cables. The transformation wasn't a shift into a wolf, but a shift into war. "But I am not normal." He turned to face the oncoming wave of teeth and claws. The first rogue leapt, a blur of gray for aiming for Maddox's throat. The room held its breath. Maddox didn't even shift his stance. He caught the 300-pound beast in midair with one hand. The sound of the impact was sickening, a wet thud. As Maddox's fingers closed around the wolf's throat, with a roar that shook the dust from the rafters, Maddox used the wolf as a bludgeon, swinging the body like a flail to knock back to other attackers. It was a massacre. The rumors of the Mega Alpha were not exaggerated. They were understatements. Maddox moved with a terrifying, impossible combination of speed and brute force. He was a tank with the agility of a viper. He threw an attacker across the room as if it were a ragdoll, the body crashing through the buffet table in a shower of silverware and dice. He snapped bones with casual swipes of his arms. His movements were efficient, brutal, and devoid of mercy. But he was fighting a war on two fronts. Every movement sent a spike of agony through his brain as the hidden sonic emitter continued its relentless high-frequency assault. He was fighting blind, guided only by instinct and the desperate need to keep the monsters away from the small woman behind him. Vance, watching from the safety of the perimeter, realized his mistake. The drugs hadn't weakened Maddox enough. The ferals were dying. The traitor's eyes shifted. He couldn't kill the king in combat, but he could break the king's spirit. While Maddox was occupied with 3 ferals near the orchestra pit, tearing through them with savage efficiency, Vance circled the chaos. He moved like a snake weaving through the panicked guests, his eyes locked on Sienna. She was standing near an overturned table, her back to a stone pillar, watching Maddox with wide, terrified eyes. She was armed only with a heavy silver serving fork she had grabbed in desperation, holding it like a dagger. Vance lunged. "No," Maddox roared. He heard the shift in the air, the intent directed at his mate. He spun around, ignoring the feral that sank its teeth into his forearm. He backhanded the wolf away, shattering its jaw, and charged across the slick floor. He was too far away. The distance was impossible to close in time. Vance raised the poisoned dagger, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "Watch him break, little girl. Watch him leap over your corpse." Sienna didn't scream. She didn't cower. In that split second, time seemed to slow. She saw the madness in Vance's eyes, the sweat on his brow. But she also saw something else. She saw the small black box hidden in the flower arrangement near Vance's feet, the device that was humming, vibrating, emitting the torture that was blinding her mate. The noise is the weapon, she realized. If I stop the noise, I free the king. She didn't retreat. She stepped forward. Vance slashed. The jagged blade caught her shoulder, slicing through the emerald silk and biting into skin. The sting was sharp and hot, and blood blossomed instantly, staining the green fabric black. Sienna, Maddox's scream was a sound of pure devastation. But Sienna ignored the pain. She ducked under Vance's arm, scrambling toward the buffet table. She didn't go for a weapon. She grabbed a heavy crystal pitcher filled with ice water. "Look at me," Vance shouted, turning to finish her off. Sienna spun around, heaving the pitcher with all her strength. She didn't aim at Vance. She aimed at the floor, directly at the sparking, humming black box nestled in the roses. "Shut up," she yelled. Crash. The water and ice hit the exposed electronics of the emitter. Z-I-Z-Z pop. The device short-circuited with a violent flash of blue light and a puff of acrid smoke. The high-frequency wind died instantly. The silence that followed was deafening. It was as if the world had suddenly snapped back into focus. Maddox, suddenly free of the background agony that had been plaguing his senses for hours, skidded to a halt. He blinked, the red haze lifting from his vision. He felt a surge of pure, unadulterated power, crisp, clean, and limitless. His curse, the sensory overload, vanished. He looked at Sienna clutching her bleeding shoulder. Then slowly, terrifyingly, he turned his head to Vance. Vance froze. The dagger trembled in his hand. He looked at the king, and for the first time, he understood the gravity of his error. He hadn't unleashed a beast. He hadn't shackled a god. "You?" Vance stammered, backing away. "We can negotiate." The council. Maddox didn't negotiate. He moved faster than the eye could follow. He closed the distance in a single stride, grabbing Vance by the lapels of his expensive suit. He lifted the man 3 feet into the air and slammed him into the stone pillar with enough force to crack the masonry behind him. Dust fell from the ceiling. "You poison my mind," Maddox growled, his face inches from the traitors. The sound was low, intimate, and horrifying. "You tortured me for 3 years. You tried to turn me into a monster to suit your ambition." He tightened his grip, bunching the fabric until Vance gasped for air, his feet kicking uselessly. "But you made a mistake," Maddox whispered, his eyes glowing with a lethal intensity. "You threatened her." Vance wheezed, the dagger clattering uselessly to the floor. Maddox didn't kill him. Death was too easy. He tossed Vance to the floor at the feet of the Southern Alpha, who had emerged from the crowd with his security detail. "Arrest him," Maddox commanded, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "If he moves, tear his throat out." The fight was over. The surviving ferals, seeing their paymaster defeated and facing the enraged, unfettered king of the north, turned and fled into the night, followed closely by the estate security who had finally rallied. Maddox stood in the center of the ruined ballroom, his chest heaving. His tuxedo was shredded, blood some his, mostly not soaked his white shirt. He looked terrifying, a figure carved from violence in marble. The guests held their breath. Was he still the Mad King? Was the danger over? Maddox turned slowly. He ignored the alphas. He ignored the whispers. He walked straight to Sienna. She was leaning against the table, her hand pressed over her wound, her face pale. Though she wasn't looking at him with fear, she was smiling. Maddox dropped to his knees before her. The entire room gasped. The Alpha King never kneeled. It was against protocol. It was against nature. "You're bleeding," he said, his voice trembling, stripped of all its command. The hands that had just crushed a rebellion were now hovering gently over her injury, afraid to taint her. "It's just a scratch," Sienna whispered, though her voice wavered. She reached out with her good hand and touched his face. wiping away a streak of dark blood from his cheekbone. "You're okay. You're quiet. Because of you," Maddox said, the realization breaking his voice. He rested his forehead against her stomach, closing his eyes, surrendering to her touch. "You saved me, Sienna. I broke the chains, but you broke the silence." A slow applause started from the back of the room. Then another. Then, like a dam breaking, the entire hall erupted. It wasn't polite applause. It was a roar of approval. Eighth Underus acknowledgement of the new order. The Southern Alpha raised his glass high. "To the king," he shouted, "and to the queen who tamed him." 3 days after the incident in the ballroom, a heavy, cleansing snow began to fall over the Pacific Northwest. It blanketed the jagged cliffs and the dark stone of the Vulkov estate, burying the shattered glass and the bloodstains under a pristine layer of white. For the first time in a decade, the silence inside the mansion didn't taste like fear. It felt like peace. Sienna sat in the high-back leather chair of the private library, a fire crackling in the hearth before her. The warmth seeped into her bones, soothing the ache in her bandaged shoulder. The pack physician, a capable woman named Drive Sloan, who had replaced the treacherous staff, had assured her the wound would heal without a scar, thanks to the accelerated healing of the wolf blood now mingling with her own through the proximity to the Alpha. But Sienna didn't mind the idea of a scar. It was proof that she had stood her ground. She stared into the flames, her mind replaying the chaos of the gala. It felt like a lifetime ago that she was wiping down tables in a diner in Idaho, worrying about her father's gambling debts. Now she was sitting in a castle, the savior of a king. The heavy oak door creaked open, breaking her reverie. Maddox entered. The change in him was nothing short of miraculous. The dark, bruised circles that had haunted his eyes for years had vanished, replaced by a clarity that was almost startling. He moved differently, too. The predatory, coiled tension, the look of a man constantly expecting an attack from within his own mind, was gone. He didn't loom. He simply occupied the space with a quiet, assured confidence. He wore a soft gray wool sweater and dark denim, looking less like a weapon of war and more like a man who had finally found his way home. Dr. Vayrys was apprehended at the airstrip in Seattle, Maddox said quietly, closing the door behind him to shut out the draft. He moved to the ottoman opposite her chair, sitting so he was at eye level with her rather than towering over her. "Did he talk?" Sienna asked, her voice soft. "He sang," Maddox replied, a dark edge to his voice. "He confessed everything. Since my father's death, Vance had him administering a cocktail of synthetic stimulants and hallucinogens into my food. They called it treatment for my size, but it was designed to induce paranoia and aggression. They were manufacturing the madness." Maddox looked at his hands, the hands that had destroyed the chains in the basement. "They wanted a monster to scare the enemies. But they needed me unstable enough so the council would eventually remove me. Vance wanted the regency. He wanted the power without the burden of the crown. He's gone now, Maddox," Sienna said, reaching out to touch his knee. "He can't hurt you anymore." "Vance has been formally exiled," Maddox confirmed, turning his hand to capture hers. His skin was warm, his grip firm but incredibly gentle. "If he steps foot in North America again, the treaty ensures he will be hunted by every pack from Alaska to Mexico. He is a ghost." He looked at her then, his moss-green eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "But I didn't come here to talk about traitors. I came to talk about us." Sienna's heart skipped a beat. She pulled her hand back slightly, tucking a stray lock of auburn hair behind her ear. "The staff, they're calling me Luna. They're asking me about menu changes and interior design. Maddox, I'm just a waitress from Idaho. I don't know how to be a queen. I don't know pack law. I don't know how to play these political games. I don't need a politician," Maddox said firmly, cutting through her insecurity. "I have plenty of those. I have advisors, lawyers, and diplomats, and half of them tried to kill me." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. The fabric was worn with age, the black velvet faded to a deep charcoal. I don't need someone who knows which fork to use at a state dinner, Maddox continued, his voice dropping to a husky whisper. I need a partner. I need the person who walked into a cage when everyone else ran away. I need the woman who looked a monster in the eye and saw a man worth saving. He opened the box. Sienna gasped. Inside sat a ring that seemed to hold the very soul of the forest. It was a raw, uncut emerald, massive and glowing with an inner light, set in a band of black titanium that had been forged to look like twisted roots. It was the ancestral ring of the Vulkov matriarchs. A piece of jewelry that hadn't been worn since Maddox's mother passed away. The council called this morning, Maddox said. They want to formalize the union. They want a coronation. But I don't care about their laws. He took the ring from the box and held it between his thumb and forefinger. The mating bond, he murmured. I felt it the moment you touched me in the basement. My wolf recognized you before my mind even understood what was happening. That's why the pain stopped. Sienna, you are my mate. Not because of a lottery, not because of a debt, but because you are the only one strong enough to hold me. Sienna looked from the ring to his eyes. She saw the vulnerability there, the terrifying openness of a man who had spent his life building walls. She realized then that her strength wasn't in physical power or political savvy. Her strength was her heart. I'm not going anywhere, she whispered. Maddox slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly as if it had been resisting itself for centuries waiting for her. Then roll with me. He leaned in and for the first time he kissed her. It wasn't the tentative, fearful touch of a stranger. It was a claiming. As their lips met, a jolt of electricity, the true alpha spark coursed between them. It wasn't painful. It was like coming up for air after being underwater for years. It was slow, tender, and filled with a desperate, overwhelming gratitude. It was the kiss of a man who had been drowning and had finally found the shore. 5 years later, the Vulkov estate was no longer a fortress of solitude. It was the heart of the Northern Alliance. The grand ballroom, once the site of a massacre, was now filled with the sound of a string quartet and the laughter of dignitaries from across the continent. The Vulkov curse was a distant memory, a dark chapter in a history book that had been rewritten. King Maddox stood on the balcony watching the snowfall. He was still a giant of a man, his presence commanding respect from every alpha in the territory. But the rage was gone. He was the architect of the Great Peace, the leader who had united the warring factions. But he wasn't watching the guests. He was watching the garden below. There, bundled in winter coats, 3 rambunctious, oversized pups, 2 boys and a girl, were wrestling in the snow. They were strong, displaying the megagenetics of their father, but they were laughing. Sienna stepped out onto the balcony beside him. She wrapped her arm around his waist, leaning her head against his arm. She radiated the calm, assured power of a true Luna. They're going to destroy the rose bushes again, she noted with a smile. But then Maddox rumbled, pulling her closer into his warmth. Roses grow back. Childhoods don't. He looked down at his wife, the waitress who had walked into the rain, the girl who had saved him. In the nursery later that night, after the dignitaries had gone and the pups were tucked into their oversized beds, the children begged for a story. They didn't want to hear about wars or treaties. Tell us about the monster in the basement, the youngest boy chirped. It wasn't a monster, the girl corrected him sleepily. It was Daddy. Maddox sat on the edge of the bed, his massive hand resting gently on the quilt. He looked at Sienna, who was leaning against the doorframe, the emerald ring glinting in the soft light. That's right, Maddox said softly. But the story isn't about the monster. It's about the brave girl in the raincoat who walked into the dark. And what did she do? The boy asked, his eyes heavy. Maddox smiled, an expression of pure and burdened love. She turned on the light.